history of America.
We must understand that the founding of the Berry Farm community was consistent with the realization that there was a pressing need for decent, livable space for black people.
Did y'all know this was the first free black community in D.C.?
I didn't know that.
Berry Farm is the first black community established in D.C. After the Civil War. It's the first place in the district where blacks could own property. So we used to own all this land and build our houses on it.
It is an historic undertaking, and although it's not seen that way today because most people don't know the history.
It was a model community, believe it or not. It was General Howard's pride. We're at the corner of Morris Road and Nichols Avenue. And this is the boundary of the Berry Farm community. The people that lived this side of from Morris Road back were mostly black families. And the people that lived from Chicago Street on were mostly white families.
The heart of Berry Farm today is much smaller.
The community that we're talking about starts at Morris Road to our north and ends at St. Elizabeth Wall to our south, and then from Anacostia River to the west and going eastward towards Alabama Avenue, almost to Alabama Avenue.
As I begin to look at the background of Berry Farm, I discovered that it was once a former slave plantation.
This is my name. The head man, Berry Farm, that's a my name, you know what I mean? And this was like back in slavery time, this was all his land or whatever.
Berry Farm's origins are quite literally explained by the neighborhood's name. The land was a part of a farm owned by James Berry in the mid-19th century.
We know about the Berry plantation at the present, or what's now known as Berry Farms, which is a really kind of cute way of calling it, right? Berry Farms, as if there was no exploitation occurring. The Berry plantation was primarily a tobacco plantation.
Berry Farms, it was a big hood. Like it was just big, like 375 acres. That's a lot.
That's land right there.
That's the 375 acres that was purchased by Howard, General Howard. And as I say, it was purchased by the Freedmen's Bureau. They bought these 1 acre lots. This is 1 acre, roughly. And they were supposed to, the idea was that they would work in the city if they could. If not, they would raise plants and animals.
Here was a real-time example of the industry and a demonstration of the aspirations of African American people. Here you could go see the clapboard cottages. You could see the yards full of pigs and chickens, and the cows that roam the street. And you might find in Berry Farm something that at least has always reminded me of an African village. There were those boys, young boys, who were assigned to gather up everybody's cattle and herd them over to pasture, and then to bring them back in the evening for milking.
That's like having
pigeons. You see a little pigeon run past, chicken run past, catch it, chop his head, all we eating. There
was only wells, spring-fed and artesian, but despite the rather primitive circumstances by our own standards today, Berry Farm represented a refutation of the stereotype that blacks were ignorant and lazy, that they were incapable of planning and conducting their lives. It was a shining example of what could happen if you only gave African Americans a chance.
This particular tract of land was hilly. And when I started reading the history, I didn't realize a dale meant it was a valley. But so it was hills and dales. And they decided, well, we're going to change this name to Hillsdale. You just look at the terrain, the land that they had to tame. Because, I mean, this land was growed up. There were nothing but trees. So these families had to come in and they bought their acre, and they had to cut down all those trees. And if you know anything about felling a tree, cutting the tree is half of the work. Getting the stump out of the ground with the roots is the other half. And they walked out of this community every day and walked up Nichols Avenue, which was at that time probably called Asylum Road, because it was the road to St. Eve. And they walked Asylum Road all the way back down, many of them to the bridge, and walked across the bridge to work, wherever they worked at in the district. And at night they walked back across that bridge, back up the road to wherever they were living at in this territory, and built their houses at night under candlelight, using pick and shovel and hoe.
And it really was a real challenge. And these people were true heroes. That they would come in there and buy first they had a purchase lease program where they would actually, many of them worked for the Freedmen's Bureau, and they would deduct so much money out of their pay each time to help pay for the lot. And in about 2 years, most of them had purchased the lot. Now, not all of them built right away. You can see the names here, and some of them, and some of the lots filled in later. And most of the people who didn't come right away lived on 7th Street. I don't know why, but over in the district, over and over on the other side of the river.
For many blacks, going across the Navy Yard Bridge and setting up a home in Berry Farm required a tremendous leap of faith and an absolute demonstration of rock solid courage. You were going out from the center of the city. You were going into an environment, while not unfamiliar to you, because most blacks had come from farms and agricultural backgrounds, but at the same time, you felt that you were in danger. And what I mean by that is that not only there were many white attitudes in Washington County that did not wish to see a black self-reliant community exist there, but also we have a fascinating letter written by Lafayette Baker to Abraham Lincoln. And it talks about how even in 1863, even after the emancipation, black folk coming into the district were being murdered by slaveholders who did not want to see their movable property get free. And Baker tells Lincoln, he says, you can see dead bodies, in a short distance from the White House. And so even though the Emancipation Proclamation had occurred, trust me, the vituperation and bitterness, the hatred of our desire for freedom was leading to outright murder in and around the district.
So they moved into this block and were very successful, very close-knit neighborhood, quite successful. And I followed them through history up until about the end of World War II, when the city did a job on them. Let me just tell you, the city was incredibly cruel and mean to all of Hillsdale, not just my block, but especially on my block. They built there's an overcrowding of poverty there. They built public housing in the middle of the block and at both ends. And I can go into detail about this, but there was an incentive to builders to build, namely through loan guarantees, to build very shabby construction and then not maintain it. And of course, no crime control at all, and it just went incredibly downhill. This is a man selling a pig on the market, and over here is a man who's raised something, maybe acorns or something, and he's selling it on the street. This man is shoveling snow, and this is just what the people in my block came over to the city to do, to raise money. So they would, for example, grow the pigs on their lot and then sell them later.
So you see how people now from Berry Farm, they walk down the Cosby Park to fish. But back then, people used to walk to like Popular Point, they go fish. It was a good little fishing site.
We talking, you get guys who would get stands and set up stands to try to make money. These sort of small ventures into economic development. Well, that happened with residents in Berry Farm, where they would go to the riverside, fish, and then bring their collections and cook them downtown, etc., and sell them just like it was a hot dog stand. But that was economic development.
So they cut it off, put a big old railroad track. You might see it there, but it's gone right now. A big old railroad track.
Put a highway.
Then they built Suitland Parkway.
You had the B&O Railroad that came before Suitland Parkway that cut the community's access to the Anacostia River. And then, of course, they built 295 here, and 295 connects the military infrastructures here in Washington, D.C. to the NSA and the military infrastructures in places like Greenbelt.
That was the Air Force.
Yeah, that was the Air Force. But now, like in the 20th century, Berry Farms got broken down into like a smaller hood, like it is today. It was a little bit left of Berry Farms, like the houses, the apartments in Potchester, which we live in.
Berry Farm was actually much larger, but its government encroachment, private business encroachment, has eaten up the edges of Berry Farm for highways and businesses.
The lady around here, she was around here for a minute, like Berry Farm was really a farm, like had hands was running around. She been around from the first time they remodeled it and all that.
When I first moved down here, it was beautiful. Really, we had a lot of veterans here with their families. We could go out anywhere in the community. You could leave your back and front door open. Nobody would walk in and steal anything. The neighbors were just like family. They looked out for one another. The children wasn't in trouble at that time. They believed in killing and carrying on like they are now. It was like a calm, clean, quiet community.
As I stand here, my mind goes back a long time ago when I first came to Washington. I lived in Northwest, and I didn't know anything about Southeast at all. I heard these rumors about Southeast, which weren't very positive, but I didn't know anything about Southeast, like a lot of folks did.
Berry Farms was beautiful. When I first moved here, I moved over into 1123 Sumner Road. That was my first house, and I was pregnant. I found out it was a lot of activities. The people were more warmer with each other. The families and like your next door neighbor and around worked with you together, communicated together. And we had organizations that reached out to us to help us keep going and being into positive things. Because we had the co-ops, picking the vegetables out here on the property, going to pick the vegetables. We had a youth council. We had trips going on. We had people out here volunteering just to keep the property, beautiful.
My first official look at Berry Farms was 1979 when I ran for mayor in 78 and won against the odds. Housing was public housing and community development was all one agency at the time, and there was no local money put in renovations, all federal money, which was not nearly enough. And this area here was not like it looks now, even though it doesn't look too good now. It was awful, but the spirit of the people was still depressed.
Well, we had concerned parents at that time, and they were close to their children. Some of them would walk to school with them, see what they were doing in school. I know, but my husband and I worked as an LPN nurse at GW Hospital. On the weekends that I was off, we would have our children get one friend, and we'd carry them out to Blue Ray cabins or just carry them out of Washington, D.C. to let them know there was something besides the community that they could get involved in and have a good time.
I think I might have been $18, $20 million of the district's capital money in the Berry Farm. It was the first public housing to use local money because I was insistent that people who live in public housing shouldn't live in squalor, shouldn't live in dirt and decrepit kind of house conditions, that they shouldn't be treated as second, third class citizens. Incidentally, a lot of folks think Berry Farm named after me, but it wasn't, as you know. And because of your work, I learned a lot more about Berry Farm.
At that time, everybody was calling, that's my cousin, or that's my friend, or that's my schoolmate. And they confide in each other, got along very well. And I would love to see that again.
I don't get it, cause like some of his beefing with, like right now, that be Barry Farms.
Used to be Barry Farms.
So
they are in us.
they like a part of our history, but it's the same how we like beefing over like probably some dumb or something.
Right.
Again, this is what makes Washington D.C. a really interesting place with regards to history, because the first housing site was Barry Farm.
If you look at our young people that are in the Barry Farms community now, most of them aren't even connected with the fact that the soil that they're living on was freedmen's soil. Men who had worked their way out of nothing, moved to a land from some plantation that they may have escaped from, or some life where they had to actually buy their freedom, almost a form of incarceration, moved into a community where there were trees, no sewer, no electricity, no plumbing, no frills.
If you notice the names of the streets, they named all the streets for people who they thought helped to free them from slavery.
Wade Road, that's his own street. Stevenson, Summerville, First Sterling.
So all these streets have a significance to the community. The street names from Morris Road back are named for abolitionists and people who did good towards the community.
What's being lost in that first is that there are people of color who are deeply interested in the conditions of people of color, and that's lost. And so when you go, for example, to communities here like Barry Farm, you have Thaddeus Stevens, you have, which is a road named after him, you have Charles Sumner, which has a road named after him, particularly in Barry Farm. And so affixed to these black communities are these white important people. But where are the people of color who have historically been about making change in the communities? And that's kind of lost on this, and that's unfortunate. And it's not to take away from what the white abolitionists have done to improve our communities through the Freedmen's Bureau or thereafter.
One of the tasks that we took on was to advocate to developers coming into this area to help us salvage this history. The building that the Salvation Army is building here, they named it Solomon G. Brown after one of the first residents in the Barry Farm community.
Through grassroots efforts, we've caused the Salvation Army to carry his name, the Solomon G. Brown Salvation Army.
Y'all know about Solomon G. Brown, who he was?
No.
Solomon G. Brown, who they named the Salvation Army after?
But the sad part is that there is such a disconnect between the legacy of Solomon G. Brown and the early members of the Barry Farm community up into the present, that putting his name there doesn't mean anything for the community, because we don't know his story. And we don't know the significance of him.
The most famous people lived on my block.
Or Elvins.
Yeah, it's incredible. Solomon G. Brown. See his name right here? Solomon G. Brown.
His name is here?
Solomon G. Brown, right,
Yeah, well, Solomon G. Brown was first born, he was born in Washington, D.C. February 14th, 1829.
Well, I mean, there's books on Solomon G., as you probably know.
He was the fourth child out of 6.
He did poetry. His poetry was read all through D.C. His poetry was in the African American newspaper.
He was the poet laureate, he was a poet, and I've got some of his poems, of the Filmmaker Society. That was a special, they had a number of cultural groups. This is before television, so people had, they had a whole bunch of social groups. He would write a number of poems, just any occasion, like Easter morning or someone's wedding or whatever. He would polish a poem and give it.
And like, it was just like 6 kids and his mother.
So when he turned 14, he had a job working for the post office.
I gather he was kind of a Renaissance man. In fact, one of the books I read called him a Renaissance man. He just could do all sorts of things.
Basically, he had to do everything on his own. He had to learn on his own, learn how to read on his own, math, science, biology, geography.
He was a naturalist. He was a scientist. He was very well respected. I think when he retired from the Smithsonian Institute, he was one of their longest employees.
He was smart.
He was a hard worker, basically. He was a smart person.
He was an expert on plants and animals and things like that.
Well, it's interesting. He was very influential. You know that new Salvation Army building?
Yes.
They named it after him.
Yeah.
And I heard he's very instrumental in helping mobilize the Berry Farm community as well.
Yes.
This area also had what they call a territorial government. And so there was Solomon Brown from this area represented the community in the territorial government for the United States.
And he was elected both by blacks and whites. And this is back when it was truly, I mean, they weren't integrated, but they were both blacks and whites, and primarily white at that time. They elected him all 4 years that he was on the territorial government. And he was quite instrumental in arguing for a number of things like the sewers and the water and, all the things, the city services, I guess is the best way to say it.
I would be like Solomon G. Brown. Because Solomon G. Brown, he came from nothing for real. He came from like scratch. Like they started off with, they came before they built these houses. They came here with candle lights, axes, rakes, shovels, all that. They built houses. They was poor, homeless. When nobody give them nothing. Like this is like they had to build from scratch. And so like I'd be like him, cause he came from this Berry Farms. He came from this, and now look where he at. You reading about him in your history books.
Right, teaching you something.
They're teaching you something, and so if he can make it out, you can make it out.
But the sad part is, I had to find him on the internet. I didn't even learn about him on school. I wonder why is he not in our textbook?
Yeah, you got everybody else like Hitler, like people like that.
And I don't even know Hitler.
What that mean? Hitler was killing our kind.
He had the thing.
If you ain't blonde hair or blue eyes. Solomon G. Brown, he was helping our kind who ain't got nothing until they can get some.
Right, I want to learn about
like
somebody where I live at.
I probably live in his house.
I'm learning about a dude with a soul patch.
Already over in Uniontown. We must understand that Uniontown, under the Uniontown Land Development Company, and under people like John Van Hook, who initially had the house that we call Cedar Hill today, intended for Uniontown to be a white working class suburb. And originally written into the charter of Uniontown was a provision that no Negroes, no mulattoes, no pigs, and no soap boiling. So, I mean, that's clear. They did not intend and did not seek to have blacks anywhere in that immediate vicinity.
Frederick Douglass became one of the first persons to actually buy property within this community, and that's because the community was failing. It wasn't that he had somehow broke some racial barrier. It's because economically this idea of building this sort of white space it was a failure. It was an economic failure.
The company that established Uniontown went into bankruptcy. When the company failed in 1870s, Douglass was able to acquire the house of one of the developers on top of the hill.
People would be surprised to know that Frederick Douglass, before 1877, purchased his house in Cedar Hill. He lived in Berry Farm.
His family was already staying east of the river, or in Anacostia, or in what we call Berry Farm. And they moved in 1867, which is another significance to this community. It showed the prominence of the people who stayed in the community. Frederick Douglass's, two of his sons stayed here, Charles Douglass and Frederick Douglass's grandchildren was in this community. So when Douglass moved to Cedar Hill in 1877, his family was already here. Charles Douglass, the Douglass boys were instrumental in helping to organize the early community. And that was very significant because the Douglasses had served in the 54th Massachusetts, the black battalion that fought in the Civil War. And if you remember the movie Glory,
That movie was based on the 54th Massachusetts. Douglas's sons were officers in the 54th. Frederick Douglass himself was a recruiter for blacks to join the 54th Massachusetts. Charles Douglass became school board president, and then Douglass Elementary School was named for Charles Douglass, not just Frederick Douglass. So you see that the Douglasses were very prominent in this Barry Farm community. Frederick Douglass died the day he was supposed to have a speech, or do a speech at Campbell AME Church, which is right up on the avenue, Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue. But Douglass was a regular participant in that church, in the church's activities in the area.
Samuel Emerson was one of the key people who organized the Pearl Escape in connection with Paul Jennings and Daniel Bell. They all had very large families, and the Emerson's family were in danger of their two youngest sisters, 13 and 15, Mary and Emily Emerson, being sold into some forms of sexual bondage, housework, and breeding to some extent. And he just wasn't going to stand by. His oldest brother had already tried an unsuccessful slave attempt, but he was going to make sure that this happened, and he helped plan the escape. On the morning of the escape, that evening actually of the escape, he left Bury Farms area and crossed what is now considered the Frederick Douglass Bridge in order to head to 15th Street to meet up with his other siblings, along with his mother and father. He met them there, and his sisters, and they actually escaped to the southwest waterfront and to what is now considered James Creek, which was then the Washington Canal, very smelly sewer-filled tributary. So Samuel Emerson had played an integral role in the escape. He was from the Bury Farms community, which is now in southeast Washington, D.C., and was so vital in the planning and the escape. His sisters later went on to form Women's College, which has now been combined to University of Columbia. There's so much rich history around it. Frederick Douglass, who lived in southeast, not too far from Bury Farms community, actually had got involved by helping to free them once they were captured. He got involved later on in history. Dolly Madison's had slaves that were on the vessel. John Quincy Adams later defended the two captains who had been arrested as a result of their participation in the escape. So the history is so rich, and is right here steeped in East Washington, D.C., as well as Georgetown, Alexandria, Virginia, parts of Maryland along the Potomac River, and all throughout Capitol Hill. These 77 slaves came from all over. There were a large portion that came from the Bury Farms, Southeast, and Ward 7 communities. One of the main figures in the escape was Samuel Emerson, right out of Bury Farms. And I think this story speaks directly not only to the community, but to the young people who are looking for change in their lives. And they can look to Sam Emerson as an example of what it takes to not only get freedom, but fight to keep your freedom. It's never free. And I think history teaches that.
Howard Gasaway was the first Commodore of the Seafarers Yacht Club. And that's a very important group. That was the first African-American yacht club in the country, and probably the world. And they
probably the world.
Well, I would say yacht club. Yeah, probably. Maybe there was one. Might have been, well, let's just claim this country. But what they did was they wanted a guy named Lewis, and I think there was a Lewis on my street, but it's a common name. You can't be sure they're related. They found this thing called the Seafarers Yacht Club down on the Anacostia. And the Anacostia is right down here. And they no one would lease them space on the Anacostia River for their yacht club. So they went to Ike's, ICKES, in the Roosevelt administration, and they pulled some, and they also used Bell and Roosevelt, and they put enough pressure on that Ike's came through and said, okay, you got to let these people have their own yacht club. So this guy Lewis Green, he was the president, and Gasaway, Howard Gasaway was the first Commodore.
Do y'all know who General Howard is? Y'all know Howard Road right there by the Metro, right? Y'all know who that's named after? General Howard.
General Howard was appointed to be in charge of what became known as the Freedmen's Bureau. by President Abraham Lincoln before Lincoln was assassinated. But his real work didn't start until after Lincoln's assassination. Lincoln had some other people in mind who declined, and Howard was appointed as a, so to speak, a personality of last resort. Howard had the reputation. He fought in the war, and he was a strong soldier, but he also had the reputation of being an Indian killer, because he also fought against the Indians and was ruthless. He was a soldier, and he took the responsibility of carrying out this post and this position, and he did. He executed it in the fashion of a soldier carrying out his orders. Howard was in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, and the job of the Freedmen's Bureau was to put people back on the land who had been displaced during the war, and also to educate the newly freed men and women.
So this was ultimately the purpose, but we must consider the founding of the Freedmen's Bureau and the operation of the Freedmen's Bureau in the context of the tremendous opposition that it faced. And that's one of the reasons why General Howard set up a trustee. Senator Pomeroy was apparently knew Howard, General Howard. They had an association through the Congregationalist Church. Pomeroy was what we today would call a liberal white man. And he was one whose character Howard felt he could trust in such a bold undertaking. Elvins was a local hardware magnate who was maybe, while not necessarily in love with black people, certainly understood the necessity of having black folk at least get a decent start in life. And so he brought these men into this scheme by which they would use money, about $52,000, to buy a 300 plus acre farm on the other side of the eastern branch.
One of his initiatives, because the Congress didn't provide any money for them to provide housing for these people, they were all staying in what they call contraband camps. And Howard's initiative to establish this community came out of the outcry of property owners in the district who wanted these people to stop squatting on their property and staying in their backyards and front yards and in the public properties.
He gave money to the 3 colleges, and the colleges purchased the land. And then as they sold off the lots...
And what colleges were these?
Well, Howard and Lincoln, I can't remember the third one. I think it was Lincoln.
And then they purchased the land.
Yeah. Well, Howard did it all for them.
Howard even made arrangements for lumber to be brought in. Mm-hmm. And so a community began to take shape. And a rural community that is primarily African American, that within a few years is going to make itself known as a place of industry, a place of great spirituality. It is a beacon and anchor of self-reliance. These are and a desire for education.
But essentially the land was owned by the 3 universities, 3 African-American universities. And then as they sold off the lots, the money went, and some of them were rented, by the way, the money went to the colleges.
When your ancestors bought their lots, that money that they paid helped to go back and fund the start of Howard University.
So that's one of the ways that Howard University was first funded.
It was a wonderful experiment that continued into the 1870s. And General Howard, at the same time that he was establishing Howard, was also behind the establishment of black educational institutes elsewhere in the South. Education was absolutely something that he was devoted to for black folk. And we have the lasting monument to that, which we call Howard University.